So let's start that talk about innovation, how it happens, and why it happens. Please welcome Scott Anthony.
Thank you, Tanya, and good morning, everyone. I am delighted to be here. I was captivated by the title of this forum, Disruption Ahead, because I have been obsessed with the idea of disruptive innovation for almost 20 years now. I was first introduced to the concept by Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen, the father of the idea of disruptive change. I was a student of his in 2000. After graduating from the Harvard Business School, I managed Christensen's research activities for a couple years. We co-wrote a book together called Seeing What's Next. In 2003, I became the third person at a small consultancy he had co-founded called Innosight. My mission since 2003 has been to help people all around the globe confront the challenge of disruptive change. Our fundamental purpose is to empower forward-thinking leaders to navigate disruptive change and own the future. I'm going to talk this morning about how exactly you do that. To do that, I have to step back in time a little bit and give you a brief history of innovation. You see, I would argue we are entering innovation's fourth era, where people inside large established organizations have a chance to do something remarkable. To explain that, though, let's go back to innovation's first era. For most of human history, innovation was done by individuals. The magician in innovation, the hero in the innovation story, was always an individual inventor. You know this because if you look at the world-changing inventions, the world-changing innovations, you can pin a name to them. So it's Gutenberg's printing press, it's Whitney's cotton gin, it's of course Edison's light bulb. Innovation was relatively affordable. You could get the skills yourself in order to do it, so the magician here, the innovation hero, is what you would call the lone inventor. A transition began around 1910, powered by one of those lone inventors, Henry Ford. Like many great inventors, many great innovators throughout history, Ford was really good at borrowing things. The assembly line wasn't just his. He brought together a range of different ideas. But when he showed the world what scale economies would look like, as the Industrial Revolution and the machine age continued, the innovation game began to shift. Innovation began to get more expensive. It began to get more complicated. It wasn't something that an individual on their own could do anymore. So you began to have the innovation energy shift from the lone inventor to the large organizations. The second era of innovation is the era of the corporate lab. Innovation or organizations were still fluid enough that they could deal with the ups and downs and vagaries of innovation. They had the resources, they had the muscle to be able to go and do it. So the big innovations in this period we don't associate with individuals, we associate with organizations. So Procter & Gamble comes up with detergent and toothpaste and disposable diapers. DuPont comes up with the miracle molecules. Lockheed Martin has a number of game-changing defense technologies. IBM creates System 360. If you know the deep history of these organizations, you know that Victor Mills is the guy behind Pampers at Procter & Gamble. But the names are invisible to most of the world. Well, in the 1950s and 1960s, things began to change again. Organizations began to get more bureaucratic, more sclerotic. Individuals were beginning to get a little bit more rebellious. They wanted to break free from these organizations and do different things. In the late 1950s, a group of 8 engineers leaves Shockley Semiconductors to form Fairchild. They're called the Traitorous 8. Now, innovation is still expensive, so they need capital in order to do this. The Rockefeller family gives money to the Traitorous 8. Ultimately, they take this little group that they had done to give money and call it Venrock Associates, one of the oldest venture capital companies. General George Dorio forms the American Research and Development Company, writes a $70,000 check to Digital Equipment Corporation in 1958 that is worth $35 million when that company goes public in 1968. This is the third era of innovation, the era of the venture-backed startup. We can name the people again, right? We know that Microsoft is Gates and Allen. We know that Apple is Jobs and Wozniak. We know that Facebook is Zuckerberg and Sandberg. We're able to associate names with the individual innovations. This takes us up to about 2010. As I look at all of this, I'm faced with a personal choice. An opportunity opens up in our organization to move out to Singapore. I take the opportunity. The opportunity wasn't to go and take the consulting business I had helped to build in America and bring it to Asia. Rather, the opportunity was to leave the consulting business behind and go and join a sister organization that we had created called Innosight Ventures, whose intent was to incubate and invest in startup companies. I had a third era mindset. I thought if you want to leave a mark on the world, if you want to change the world, this is what you do. You go and invest in startup companies. I had a paired set of experiences in late 2010 that showed me that I had framed the problem incorrectly. That in fact, in this emerging fourth era of innovation, the best place to be if you want to have massive impact is inside a large established organization. I call this the parable of Plunify and the power of incumbency. Let me start with Plunify. Plunify was a startup company founded by two kids in Singapore. The details of Plunify's business and cloud-accelerated chip design don't really matter. The important thing about Plunify is it was the first time that we were pitched, not with a business plan, but with a business. What's the difference, you ask? Well, a business plan is facts and figures and slides and spreadsheets. A business is a functioning website, its customers, its revenues. The two kids behind Plunify built this business spending basically $0. This is the result of the third era of innovation. All the venture-backed startups, the rise of information technology means today you can get a business off the ground spending basically nothing, using freely available or close to freely available technologies. What were we looking for when we heard the pitch from Plunify? We were hunting for unicorns. If you haven't heard the phrase, a unicorn is a privately listed company worth more than $1 billion US. Today, CB Insights tells us there are more than 300 of these around the globe, worth more than $1 trillion US. Well, a couple weeks after hearing the pitch from Plunify, I found myself in India looking at a very different type of creature. This wasn't something that was created by a plucky entrepreneur. This was a new business that was created by a giant corporation. The corporation in question is Medtronic, the world's largest independent medical device manufacturer. Now, India should have been its leading market. Medtronic's flagship product is the pacemaker, a device that gets implanted in your chest to regulate the flow of electricity to your heart. India sadly has more heart disease than any country in the world. But pacemaker sales in India were minuscule. You spend 5 minutes in India and you understand. Most people pay for healthcare out of their own pocket. They couldn't afford even a basic pacemaker. Even if you could afford it, you often didn't know you needed it because primary healthcare doesn't work that well in India. Medtronic cracked the problem, not by inventing a new technology, but by pioneering a new business model called Healthy Heart for All. 3 key components to this business model. First, as you see in the picture here, direct-to-consumer marketing to raise awareness of the disease. Second, rural diagnostic camps, where in an afternoon, hundreds of people could be remotely diagnosed. Third, and probably most critically, the world's first loan program for an implantable medical device. Think about that for a second. You take out a loan to buy something like a car, and you don't pay back the loan? No big deal, right? The bank will repossess the asset. You take out a loan for a device that gets implanted in your chest and you don't pay it back? That becomes a little bit more problematic. But by drafting unproven principles in social finance and microfinance, such as community lending, over the next few years, tens of thousands of people went through this program. Hundreds of bottom-of-the-pyramid customers received these new loans, and there were virtually zero defaults. I came back from visiting this story or seeing this story in India, and I reflected on the contrast. The first time you hear the story of Plunify, if you're inside a large established organization, your natural reaction is to be scared. If you can start a business for nothing, you think, what hope do we have? We can never be as fast as entrepreneurs. That's true. But imagine you were sitting in the room listening to the pitch from Plunify. What would stop you, aside from a code of ethics, from doing the exact same thing that Plunify was doing? Nothing. Yes, it's never been easier to start a business, but that also means it's never been easier to copy a business, which means that scaling a business is still unbelievably difficult, arguably even harder than ever. Because the second you get a whiff of success, the race is on. You have to fight against all these Me Too copycats. No doubt, unicorns emerge out of this process, but make no mistake, it is brutally hard. Contrast that to Medtronic. I could tell you every detail of what Medtronic did, and you couldn't do anything about it, because you do not have what Medtronic does. Medtronic has regulatory clearance to operate in India. It has a patent-protected technology. It has access to the doctors in India. By combining those unique, difficult-to-create assets with entrepreneurial energy, it unleashed massive impact. This is the fourth era of innovation. Now, this era needed a name, so as I reflected on this story, I began to look for other stories like Healthy Heart for All, and they're out there. I saw how Hindustan Unilever was changing the way clean water was distributed in India, how Syngenta was helping smallholders all around the world to increase the productivity of their crops, how IBM was making cities smarter. And I began to notice a common element in these stories. There always was a hero. The hero in most of the stories is not a Steve Jobs-like CEO person. It's someone a little bit deeper in the organization who plays a really unique role. These are some of the heroes of the story. Let me focus on Keen Monson for a minute. When Keen Monson started the quest to create Healthy Heart for All in Medtronic, he had exactly 0 direct reports. He had a budget of exactly $0. He saw an opportunity, and he did something special. He catalyzed together the unique things Medtronic had with external entrepreneurial energy. This is the fourth era of innovation, the era of the corporate catalyst, where large organizations that think and act in the right way can have market-changing impact. Yes, it's great that Elon Musk has pioneered new battery technology, but if you want to talk about who's going to do electrification at scale, it's going to be General Motors and Toyota and Ford and the established companies. They're beginning to understand that the assets can be things that allow them to do truly astonishing things. This is the world we live in today. What's going on in financial services, and what does this mean for us? Well, there are a lot of things that are accelerating disruptive change in financial services. Let me just talk about a few of these things. I live in Singapore. I've lived there since 2010. The biggest bank in Singapore, as many of you know, is DBS. I'll talk a little bit more about DBS later. One of the big things that DBS has done over the past few years is really change its IT infrastructure. It used to outsource everything to third parties, but as you're having digitization of back office processes and other things, it has essentially insourced its technology. 70% of it now controls. It's designing for zero operations, designed for zero ops, so it can be agile, it can be flexible, it can be responsive. It views itself today as much as a technology company as it views itself a banking company. Cryptocurrency and blockchain. There's a lot of hype, no doubt, about these two underlying technologies, but you're beginning to see real disruptive use cases emerge. Anyone who is in the business of contracting, of having information flows, no doubt will see their businesses change because of distributed ledger technologies. An example of something that's just happened recently. In Singapore again, MetLife, a global insurance company, wrote the first blockchain-based gestational diabetes insurance policy, where a consumer could take the policy out and if it turned out they had gestational diabetes, get paid without any involvement of anyone throughout the system. It just happened automatically by riding on the blockchain. How could this happen in Singapore? As you talk about the changing regulatory environment, many countries are thinking about how do we encourage more innovation in financial services. Singapore created a regulatory sandbox, the Monetary Authority of Singapore did, to encourage this type of experimentation by both startups and by great big companies. In Europe, of course, people are saying everyone needs to have access to bank data. The regulatory rules are changing. The final point I'll highlight here is the competition from non-traditional competitors. Of course, if you go to a market like China, this is evidently clear as you look at Alipay and WeChat as dominant payment mechanisms, but you're seeing it in other markets as well. Our analysis of the retail banking market in Europe, as an example, I think highlights something interesting. About 10% of revenues were earned by non-banking companies in 2000. That number is up to almost 25% today, and we project it will be 50% by 2030. Banking is disappearing in lots of places with lots of new people entering into the market. Is this good or bad news for the incumbents who are represented today? Well, I mentioned Clayton Christensen in the beginning, the father of the idea of disruptive innovation. His seminal contribution to management was his 1997 book, The Innovator's Dilemma. The subtitle of that book was When New Technologies Cause Great Firms to Fail. The Innovator's Dilemma suggests that disruption ahead is bad news for all of you who are parts of large established organizations. I've told you the other side of the story. I've told you the innovator's opportunity, how corporate catalysts can enable you to go and drive disruptive change. So which one is it? Well, we're kind of in this Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities moment right now. It's the best of times, it's the worst of times. It's the spring of hope, it is the winter of despair. I can give you very credible statistics that will paint either picture for you. So imagine you are a large established company. Let's talk about the winter of despair, why we should be worried. You go back to the mid-1990s, in US exchanges, there were more than 7,000 publicly listed companies. Today, that number has been cut in half. The public company is dying. If I wanted to give you something that gave you a little bit of hope on the other side of this, the Kauffman Foundation would tell you, yes, that may be true, but it's not like entrepreneurs are really replacing them. Despite all the hype about entrepreneurialism, the number of startups is decreasing. The number of people who are being entrepreneurs is decreasing. Millennials, as much as people say they want to go work for startups, actually want the comfort of being in large established organizations. Let's go back to the winter of despair. Innosight, my organization, has done longitudinal research looking at the lifespan of companies on the S&P 500 index. You go back 2 generations ago, the lifespan was 60 years. Today, the lifespan is 23 years. Our projections suggest it will go down in a decade to 12 years. That means that 50% of S&P 500 companies today will not be on that index in 10 years. The economists would flip this argument. It would bring hope back to the incumbents. The economists would say, yes, that's true, but all this is consolidation. The big are becoming bigger. The people who have power are becoming more powerful. 44% of S&P 500 profits are in industries that essentially have moats around them that are impossible to penetrate. Final pair of statistics, CB Insights, I mentioned this before, talks about unicorns prancing all over the globe, 300 startup companies worth more than $1 billion US. The flip side of this, Bain & Company will remind us that these are anomalies. The odds if you start a company up of it succeeding, Bain's research shows, is about 1 in 500. The odds of a large company succeeding when it launches an entrepreneurial venture, that's about 1 in 8. So your odds of success are 60 times bigger if you're inside a large organization. Innovator's dilemma, innovator's opportunity, what will it be? It comes down to a pretty simple question. Alex Rampel from Andreessen Horowitz, I think, framed it perfectly. The battle between the startup and incumbent comes down to whether the startup gets distribution before the incumbent gets innovation. What does it take to get innovation? This is what I have dedicated my professional career to. I've written a bunch on the subject. I'll give you just a minute overview about some of the topics that I've written about. Some of these we might discuss more in the Q&A, we'll see. And then I want to go deeper on what will be the subject of my next book. So first, some of the things we've talked about in the past. Getting innovation means having the right strategy, having the right structures. In Dual Transformation, I and my co-authors made the case to confront the dilemmas of disruption, you need a parallel transformation effort. Transformation A is reinventing today's business. Transformation B is creating tomorrow's business. Not going into disconnected industries, but building a capabilities link between today and tomorrow. This builds on work that we had in our 2012 book, Building a Growth Factory, where we talk about the systems and structures required to make innovation systematic. Some of our other writing has looked more in the how-to of innovation, the little black book of innovation and the first mile, where we talk about the step-by-step process, addressing a critical misconception about innovation. People think it's magical, people think it's a mystery, people think it's a black art. It is none of these things. Innovation is a discipline that anyone can get better at with careful practice. In the paperback version of the little black book, I taught everything that I've learned about innovation using this simple picture here of a shark drinking a milkshake, flying a kite. Maybe we'll say more about that in the Q&A, but otherwise you got to read the book. What I want to talk about now is the next book, where we talk about getting innovation at a cultural level. How do you go and create a culture of innovation where the behaviors that drive innovation success come naturally? Now, I have a rule when I think about companies that have innovation cultures. The rule is no bats, no fangs. BAT, B-A-T, is Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent. FANG is Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. Those are all interesting companies, but they have origin stories, path-dependent histories that are impossible for just about any other company to replicate. So when I look for interesting examples, I look for what I call no debts, normal organizations doing extraordinary things. Thankfully, there is a no debt in the financial services industry. Thankfully, it's in Singapore. Thankfully, we've had the privilege of working with it. Thankfully, they've allowed me to share pieces of its story. So let me end this part of my remarks by telling you a little bit about the DBS story in Singapore. Piyush Gupta became the CEO of DBS 10 years ago, 2009. 27-year history at Citi, left a couple years in 2000 to head up a startup company, but a banker his entire life. He comes in and takes a look around and says, given all the technologies that are coming at us, all the forces at work in our industry, we have to undergo a fundamental cultural transformation. We cannot be a bank, we have to be a technology company. We cannot have a bias towards obligatory compliance to the regulator. We have to function like a 25,000 person startup. What does that actually mean and how do you actually do it? This is a complicated topic, it's a book-length topic, but I want to give you 3 pieces of advice. When you say the tomorrow culture is to be a startup at scale, how do you actually go and make that happen? It starts by getting granular. What does it really mean to be a 25,000 person startup? DBS defined the specific behaviors they were seeking in the banker of the future. We have to be agile. We have to be a learning organization. We have to be customer obsessed. We have to be data driven. We have to be experimental. Define these with enough specificity that you knew when you were doing them, you knew when you weren't doing them. That's one piece of granularity. You also have to understand what's stopping you from doing this. A few years ago, DBS took its top 300 people and brought them to an offsite to talk about what were the blockers inhibiting them from acting like a 25,000 person startup. Surprisingly, meetings rose to the top of the list. It turned out that people thought the meeting culture in DBS was at best ineffective and at worst toxic. They illustrated this in somewhat humorous ways. This is a cartoon that they produced. You have here a person saying the voice of the customer is online too. We want to be customer obsessed, right? But then the person is going into a meeting. Take a message, she says. We're having a meeting on customer obsession. Meetings are crowding out the actual behavior we want to follow. Once you identify what is blocking you from doing what you want to do,
You rip a page out of the behavioral psychology literature. You break your bad habits with what we call beans, a behavior enabler, artifact, and nudge. The bean that DBS introduced was called Mojo. Every meeting now has it. Every meeting has a designated meeting owner. The meeting owner sets the agenda. The meeting owner makes sure that the meeting starts and ends on time. The meeting owner makes sure that there's clear outcomes from the meeting. The Joe is the joyful observer. This ties to something that DBS is trying to do, which is to make banking joyful. The joyful observer gives feedback in real time to the Mo. The joyful observer makes sure that there's equal share of voice, that everybody's participating. The joyful observer has the ability, if people aren't present, if they're on their mobile phones or whatever, to stop the meeting and call for a game of phone Jenga where all the phones stack up in the middle of the table. This is a great hack to break a bad habit. Like anything that drives habit change, it's simple. I bet you months from now, you'll be able to remember the phrase Mojo. They support it with a range of different efforts. You see here little physical artifacts to support it. There's an app that you can download from the store so you can run Mojo in your own meetings. They train people so they can do it. There's communities that help make sure this all happens. It's measurable and it works. The effect of meetings has doubled as the Mojo program is rolled out. The final thing you have to recognize is that habit change, behavior change, culture change is as hard a thing as you're going to do. And some of the hardest people to change are the top leaders inside an organization. One of the organizations we've had the great privilege of studying and working with is a US-based software company called Intuit. This is about a 40-year-old organization that started with Quicken, then QuickBooks, TurboTax, and so on. About 10 years ago, its founder and still active chairman, Scott Cook, said, "We need to make design thinking a core to our organization. We have to get good at empathetically understanding our customers. We have to get good at rapid prototyping and experimenting," and started a journey to transform the culture of the organization. The lesson he learned is that you really have to disrupt development, disrupt training, disrupt the way that leaders act. He summarized it with a very simple phrase: learning by doing by everyone. This isn't just listening to people talk about what it takes to do design thinking. This is Scott Cook and his CEO and his leadership team getting out of the building and practicing actively in these new behaviors they're trying to drive through the organization. DBS has done the same thing. A few years ago, they took their top 300 people and in groups of 30 ran them through Silicon Valley-style hackathons. This is a picture of one of them. These are top leaders in the bank. The guy in the wizard hat up front is Neil Cross, who at the time was the Chief Innovation Officer. Behind him is Paul Cobbin, who is the Chief Transformation and Data Officer, doing what you do in a startup company, going and spending time with customers, understanding them, coming up with new ideas. The intent wasn't to really come up with breakthrough offerings. Rather, it was to give people a chance to learn by doing. Innovator's dilemma or innovator's opportunity. It comes down to things like this: building cultures that allow innovation to flourish, setting a new strategic direction to bring it all to reality, and doing the hard work to make it real, allowing your corporate catalyst to have impact at scale. Last slide that I will show you before I take a few questions from Tanya and we continue the discussion are my 4 lovely children. There they are. These are the proudest creation that I've ever had. These are my 4 beautiful kids from left to right. We've got Charlie, my now 13-year-old boy, wearing his idea hat. Aha, he said, I have an idea. It's Holly, my 11-year-old girl, winning $2,000 in a startup competition. This is what 11-year-olds do these days. There is my happy Harry, my 7-year-old, who's just full of joy all the time. And there's my adorable 2-year-old Teddy. I show my kids here not just because I love them, but they provide a very instructive lesson for all of us thinking about innovation. I learn from my kids every day, but the biggest lesson that I have learned from them is that we enter the world in a natural state. We are naturally curious and creative creatures. That is the way that we are born. We systematically unlearn that as we go through our lives. As school teaches us, there is a right and wrong answer. As our organizations tell us, there is a right way to do things and there is a wrong way to do things. As I've watched my children grow up, as I've been advising companies all around the globe on this topic, I have come to a belief that borders on a conviction. The world's greatest untapped source of energy isn't in the wind, it isn't in the water, it isn't in the sun. It's inside our large organizations that are filled with people like this, who have curiosity and creativity at their core. My mission as a father is to make sure my children never lose their love of learning. My mission as an advisor to large organizations is to help top leaders release, harness, and amplify the latent energy that lies within. Innovator's dilemma, innovator's opportunity. Ultimately, the choice is yours. Thank you very much.